Everyone needs a safe passage home. With me today, Amy Croto, Natural Resource Officer, working on the herring runs in the mills.
Yes.
So what happened that they might not have been able to pass through those fish runs?
Right, so over the winter, we had, 5 or so nor'easters, and obviously a lot of trees fell. And while the vast majority of trees that fell in the herring runs were not obstructing any fish passage, and we didn't have any real concerns in the spring when the adults were sort of migrating upstream because they're larger, hardier fish. The fry are emigrating from our ponds, going downstream out into the ocean to spend their first few years of life before they repeat that cycle. And this tree, just upstream of the flume at Middle Pond, had fallen in and left branches sort of in the water column. And part of the tree was dead, part of the tree is still alive, and so we had to work with DPW. Thankfully, they purchased a chainsaw that runs on vegetable oil, so it's more environmentally friendly. And we put a boat in the water, went out yesterday to remove those branches that over time would collect, leaves and would grow algae, effectively creating a net that would catch the fry because they're so small, they're only a couple inches long when they're emigrating. And act as a death trap, essentially.
Wow.
So because we're also herring wardens, aside from being natural resource officers, part of our duty to the state is to ensure safe passage for both the adults and the fry as they're leaving. So we needed to address that in order to continue moving fry downstream safely.
And that's interesting because when you are out there and this tree is down, the tree acts as other things for other species too, doesn't it?
Right. So from a conservation perspective, when you do herring run maintenance, the specific thing to focus on is creating passage for the fish, but doing minimal impact to the remainder of the environment. So pieces of the tree that were still alive, that were outside of the water column, get to stay because they provide habitat for other animals. Pieces of tree that are partially submerged but won't create any obstructions are important as basking areas for other aquatic turtles that we have here in Massachusetts. And that woody debris that sits on the bottom but isn't causing obstructions is important for larval insects, dragonflies, damselflies, mayflies, all different kinds of beetles, all live within that wood and spend a vast majority, some of them their entire lives in that system, also providing food for other species that live within those systems. So it's all important as part of the general ecosystem, even though we focus on the passage for that two species.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about herring specifically because there has been news, obviously herring trawling. There's been some legislation that's gotten through in the last days or so.
Yep.
Why are they important to the ecosystem?
Right, so they're what we call a keystone species. So their presence is usually an indicator of how environmental conditions are. So a decline in them is often an indicator of poor water quality or degrading environmental systems. They're also an extremely important food for hosts of animals that after a long winter are looking for, essentially shooting fish in a barrel. And the annual herring run, similar to the locusts every 17 years or so, but this is an annual event, provides food for so many other animals that we have here on Cape Cod. So, and historically they were very important economically, although there's a moratorium on them to be harvested currently recreationally, and there are new restrictions that are coming for the commercial harvest.
Right. So how do people know that these species are degrading in counts and numbers? Is there a system out there that counts these?
Sure. So a lot of our counts are done simply by volunteers. When the fish are running, they go out and they count for 10 minutes and an hour, submit that data, usually through their natural resource office or through their herring warden if they don't have natural resource offices. And then that information is given to the state so they can have a general idea of total population size of a run from year to year. And then they also sometimes have an additional count where the fish are getting to their spawning grounds that would indicate not only the estimate of total size of the run, but the estimate of the number of fish that actually make it to spawning grounds every year, because there is a big difference between those two numbers usually because of predation along the way as they're moving upstream. Or if any of them are sick and die, any of those sorts of things will sort of skew the numbers. So they use those numbers over a series, hopefully of at least 20 years, to look at the trends across populations across the entire state.
Wow. How many runs are there in Barnstable?
So we have the Marston's Mills River Run, the Santuit River, which is a shared herring run between Mashpee and Barnstable. We have the West Barnstable Run, which goes from Boat Cove Creek in Barnstable Harbor all the way up into Mill Pond in West Barnstable. Then we have the Centerville River Run, which some of the fish choose to go up the Centerville River and then eventually into Lake Wequaquet. And there's also passage available for them to go into Red Lily Pond and Lake Elizabeth. We also have some what were historic herring runs that are no longer functioning that we're sort of continuing to look into for rehabilitation purposes, like Lovell's Pond in Little River is one of those.
And we want to make sure that people know that they can't take these herring. It's illegal to do that.
Right, yeah, there's been a moratorium in place, and at this point it was being renewed every 3 years. But in 2014, I think it was, the Atlantic Marine Fisheries Commission put a permanent moratorium on it. So the state and the Marine Fisheries Commission would have to be given a sustainable fisheries management plan for each individual run in order for any runs to be reopened to recreational harvest. It is also important to note, though, that if you are a card-carrying tribal member, you have native rights to those fish, and so they are still allowed to harvest.
Excellent. Well, this was a great education for me, and hopefully, all those little guys get back home.
Yeah, and then hopefully in 3 years or so, we'll see them come back to repeat that process, the circle of life.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Amy.
You're welcome.